Long before anyone would come to know him for his quiet strength, Ethan Cole was just an ordinary young man from Colorado with an ordinary, predictable life. He had a stable job in a mid-sized tech company, a fiancée he adored, and a small home he'd bought with the kind of pride only a first-time homeowner knows. He wasn't rich, he wasn't extraordinary, but he was content, and he believed contentment was enough. It was strange how quickly life could unmake itself. The first unraveling came with the layoffs. His company had downsized overnight, and Ethan, despite his dedication, was among the unlucky ones. He tried to stay calm, reassuring his fiancée, telling her they would push through. But 2 months later, medical bills from an unexpected emergency drained their savings. Stress replaced warmth in their home. Silence replaced laughter. And then, one evening thick with exhaustion and frustration, she told him she couldn't do it anymore. "I need space to breathe, Ethan. I'm sorry." Those were the last words she said before walking out with a suitcase and a heart as heavy as his. The house went next. Without a job, there were no payments. Without his fiancée, there was no reason to stay. He packed what he could into his aging car, some clothes, a few books, an old photo album his mother had made, and drove away from the only life he had ever built. At 27, Ethan felt like he had already lived through a lifetime's worth of endings. Days blurred. Nights were worse. He slept in the back seat of his car, parked behind a 24-hour diner that didn't ask questions. He showered at a gym whose membership fee he prayed would not bounce. He applied for jobs until the glow of his laptop felt like an interrogation lamp instead of hope. Every rejection felt personal. Every sunrise felt heavier. There were moments, quiet, terrifying moments, when he wondered if disappearing would be easier than rebuilding. The shame was suffocating. The loneliness was a weight he carried everywhere, pressing against his ribs like stone. He avoided calling friends. Pride kept the phone cold in his hand. He kept telling himself, tomorrow will be better. But the tomorrows kept folding into each other, empty and indistinguishable. One particularly dark night, a snowstorm rolled over the city. Ethan sat in his car, wrapped in every piece of clothing he owned, shivering uncontrollably. His breath fogged the air, his fingers went numb, and for the first time, he felt a quiet acceptance settle over him. Maybe this is how it ends, he thought. Not in drama, not in violence, just fading. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, morning light seeped through the frost-covered windshield. His head throbbed, his back ached, but he was alive, and strangely, that fact anchored him. He stepped out of his car and stood in the cold parking lot, watching people move around the diner with purpose he no longer understood. A man loading boxes into a truck, a woman laughing into her phone, a child hopping between icy puddles while his father pretended not to worry. Why do they get to keep going? Why not me? He felt like a ghost among the living, moving, breathing, but no longer real. Inside him, there was nothing left but a hollow ache. No dreams, no plan, no identity. He wasn't the man with a job, or the man in love, or the man with a home. He was just remnants. Ethan didn't know it then, but this emptiness, this terrifying void, would later become the very space where something new would grow. But first, he had to survive the worst parts of himself. For weeks, Ethan moved through life like a shadow, eating little, sleeping poorly, and drifting from one parking lot to the next. His car had become both his shelter and his prison. He rarely spoke to anyone, except when absolutely necessary. Conversations felt like tasks, not connections. His mind, once energetic and hopeful, was a cluttered room with no light. He felt trapped inside it. But life has a way of slipping small miracles into the cracks of despair. It happened on a dull gray morning as Ethan sat on a bench near a public park, sipping a free cup of coffee a volunteer had offered. The park was nearly empty, the winter air sharp enough to make every breath sting.
He watched people hurry past, bracing against the cold. Then a sound broke the monotony, a soft, uneven rhythm. He turned. An elderly man struggled to tie his shoelaces, his hands trembling violently with each attempt. People walked by, glancing but not stopping. Ethan watched for a moment, debating whether he had the right to help anyone when he couldn't even help himself. But something in him, something small and stubborn, pushed him to stand. "Sir, can I help you with that?" Ethan asked quietly. The old man looked up, startled at first, then relieved. "These fingers stopped cooperating years ago," he said with a shaky laugh. Ethan knelt, tied the laces, stood, and expected the moment to end right there. But the man placed a hand on Ethan's arm and said, with startling sincerity, "Thank you, son. You made my morning." Something about that sentence hit him unexpectedly hard. He hadn't made anyone's morning in a long time. He hadn't mattered in a long time. It was just shoelaces, just a moment, but as the man slowly walked away, Ethan felt the faintest shift somewhere inside him, like the first warm breeze brushing across a winter field. It wasn't hope, not fully, but it was something close. That same afternoon, Ethan walked into the city library. He had no plan for being there. Maybe he just wanted warmth. Maybe he wanted silence without loneliness. Maybe he wanted to sit somewhere that didn't smell like car upholstery. He wandered between the aisles, ran his fingers across old book spines, and accidentally knocked over a display titled "Starting Over." He almost laughed at the irony. He picked up one of the books, an autobiography of a man who had rebuilt his life after losing everything in a fire. Ethan didn't intend to read it fully, but he skimmed a few pages. The story wasn't extraordinary. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real and oddly grounding. The author wrote, "The first step back is always small. Sometimes it's so small you don't realize you took it." He stared at that line for a long time. That night, back in his car, he opened a blank note on his phone and typed just 4 words. "I'm still here, trying." He didn't know why he wrote it. He didn't know who it was for. But writing it made him feel awake. Progress did not come easily. In fact, the next morning, he felt foolish for the little spark he had felt the day before. His mind fought him. Trying for what? Nothing will change. You had your chance. Who are you fooling? But something else, something quieter, whispered back, "Keep going." It wasn't motivation. Motivation felt too big, too glossy, too far away from where he was. This was more like a fragile thread, a thin line that connected him to some version of himself he had forgotten, but not fully lost. So Ethan forced himself to do one small thing each day. One day he cleaned his car thoroughly, folding his clothes, organizing the clutter. Another day he applied for 3 jobs instead of 1. Another day he walked for an hour around the park instead of sitting in his car. Every step felt heavy. Every effort felt too small. And every night the darkness tried to reclaim him. But the simple act of resisting, of pushing back even slightly, became its own kind of fight. And slowly, without fully realizing it, Ethan was moving forward. Winter loosened its grip slowly, like a reluctant goodbye. The nights were still cold, but the sun lingered a little longer each day, casting softer shadows on the world around Ethan. He was still homeless. He was still jobless. His life was still fragile. But he was no longer drifting. Something inside him had shifted. Not dramatically, not instantly, but undeniably. A quiet readiness was forming.
It came from a place he hadn't expected at all. One afternoon, Ethan was sitting near the community center, charging his phone from an outdoor outlet, when he overheard 2 volunteers talking about a food drive event. They were short-staffed, scrambling to sort donations before families arrived. Ethan didn't plan to get involved, but one of the volunteers, seeing him nearby, asked gently, "Hey, would you mind giving us a hand, just for an hour?" An hour! He had plenty of those. So he followed them inside. He folded clothes, sorted canned food, carried boxes to tables. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't life-changing, but something about it felt strangely grounding.
The gratitude on the families' faces, the relief in the volunteers' voices, the simple clarity of helping without expecting anything, it got under his skin in a way he didn't expect. A little girl tugged on his sleeve as she picked up a food bag. "Thank you, mister." The words lingered long after she left. Ethan found himself returning to the community center the next day, and the next, and the next. He didn't know it yet, but those small acts of service would become the blueprint of a new life. At first, he volunteered because it gave him structure, something to wake up for, something to do besides drown in thoughts. But soon, the staff began to recognize him, not as the quiet, lost young man they first met, but as someone reliable. "Ethan, would you mind helping with the evening shift? Ethan, could you talk to that elderly man? He seems nervous. We could use someone like you more often." Someone like you. He hadn't heard those words in a long time. Slowly, the center gave him more responsibility. He helped organize donation drives, packed school supplies for children, and assisted with distributing meals during night outreach programs. But rebuilding wasn't clean or linear. There were days he woke up exhausted and defeated. Days when shame crept back in, whispering that he was just a homeless volunteer pretending to matter. Nights when he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, wondering if anything he did made a difference. He struggled with anger, with grief, with memories of the life he lost. There were moments when the past felt like a ghost haunting him from just over his shoulder. But even on his worst days, he still went back. He showed up for others, even when he barely showed up for himself. And little by little, people began to rely on him, and he found himself caring in ways he didn't expect. It wasn't charity work anymore. It wasn't a distraction. It was a calling, forming quietly, without fanfare, from the cracks of a broken life.
One evening, during a cold spring rain, Ethan joined a night outreach team, handing out thermal blankets and warm meals to people living on the street. People just like he had been only weeks ago. As he approached a shivering teenage boy under a staircase, he felt a jolt of recognition. He knelt down and handed him a hot meal. "You okay out here?" Ethan asked. The boy shrugged. "Just trying to get through the night." Ethan hesitated, then gently said, "I've been where you are. It gets better. But let's get you somewhere warm tonight, all right?" The boy looked at him skeptically at first, then nodded. That night, Ethan sat with him, listened to his story, helped him connect with the shelter manager, and made sure he had a safe place to sleep. As Ethan walked back under the dim streetlights, soaked from the rain, something inside him solidified, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Purpose. Not the loud kind, not the glamorous kind, but the real kind that grows from doing something that matters. The staff at the community center noticed too. One of the coordinators pulled him aside. "Ethan, you have a gift for helping people. Not everyone can connect like that. You ever thought about doing this kind of work long term?" Long term. The idea felt impossible, overwhelming, and yet right. For the first time since everything fell apart, Ethan felt the spark of a future that he could build. Not the one he had lost, but one he hadn't even known he needed. Ethan didn't wake up one day magically healed. Healing was slow, uneven, and often invisible, like grass growing through cracked pavement. But something fundamental was changing within him. Not because life suddenly became easier, but because he was becoming someone stronger.
Months passed, and the community center became more than a place he visited. It felt like a home he never expected to have again. Ethan found a part-time position assisting with outreach programs. The pay was small, but steady enough that he eventually moved from his car into a shared room at a transitional housing facility. A simple bed, a small window, a quiet corner to call his own. The first night he slept in that room, he cried, not out of sadness, but out of sheer relief. Slowly, life began giving him mirrors that reflected the person he was becoming. Someone patient, dependable, empathetic, someone who had learned to stand back up, even when the world had knocked him flat. He stopped avoiding the past, stopped blaming himself for what he couldn't control. He began to understand something that had always lived beneath the pain. His losses did not define him. His response did. His eyes softened, his words became more thoughtful, and when he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw a man who failed. He saw a man who survived.
Ethan's journey began spreading quietly through the community center. New volunteers noticed how people gravitated toward him, not because he was loud or commanding, but because he listened with a sincerity that made others feel seen. He was asked to mentor younger volunteers. He was invited to speak at a small evening gathering for people fighting through hardship. He was paired with at-risk teens who needed steady hands and honest guidance. But the moment he realized his transformation wasn't just personal came one summer afternoon. A woman approached him after a distribution event. Ethan recognized her from months ago. She'd been struggling, overwhelmed, holding two small children close while accepting a food bag with trembling hands. Now she stood straighter, confident, grateful. "I wanted to say thank you," she said. "You probably don't remember, but months ago, when I felt like giving up, you told me that things can change. You said you were living proof. I repeated those words every night." Ethan swallowed hard. "I'm glad things are getting better," he said gently. She smiled. "They are, because someone believed I could stand again." That moment didn't just warm him, it anchored him. His journey had become a lighthouse for others navigating their own storms. As seasons passed, Ethan began something unexpected: a weekly support group in an unused room at the community center. It was simple: chairs in a circle, soft lighting, a pot of coffee. Anyone could walk in, anyone could speak or stay silent. He called it New Beginnings. The first meeting had 3 people. The second had 7. By the end of the year, there were nearly 30 attendees every week, each person carrying their own battles, each finding comfort and knowing they weren't alone. Ethan never preached, never pretended to have all the answers. Instead, he shared pieces of his own story, the raw truth of falling apart and slowly stitching himself back together. People listened. People learned. People healed. New Beginnings grew into something larger than he imagined. A local newspaper wrote about it. A nearby university invited him to speak. The community center asked if he would lead the entire outreach and recovery program. The boy who once lost everything was now building something that would outlast him. A legacy not made of money or success, but of lives quietly changed. Years had passed since the winter Ethan Cole once thought would swallow him whole. The scars of those days were still there, faint reminders etched into his memory, but they no longer held pain. They held perspective, clarity, purpose. The small shared room he once lived in turned into an apartment he could afford with the steady work he now did at the community center. His life was simple, but it was full. Full of people, full of meaning, full of quiet victories that mattered more than any job title he had ever chased. And every week, without fail, he continued leading New Beginnings, the support group that had become a sanctuary for anyone who had tasted rock bottom. On the anniversary of the program's founding, the largest crowd yet gathered in the community room. Families, teens, older men and women, people in suits and people in worn jackets, every one of them carrying a story stitched with loss and courage.
They asked Ethan to speak. He stood before them, not as a leader or a mentor, but as someone who understood what it meant to be shattered. He looked around the room, faces brimming with hope, fear, determination, and said quietly, "Most people think purpose is something you find when everything is going right, but I learned the opposite. Purpose comes from how you rise after everything falls apart." He paused, letting the words settle. "I lost my job. I lost my home. I lost the people I loved. For a long time, I thought that meant I was lost too. But life isn't defined by what breaks you. It's defined by how you rebuild. If you're sitting here with your own pain, your own mistakes, your own losses, I want you to know something." His voice softened. "You're not broken beyond repair. You're rebuilding, and that is where purpose begins." Silence filled the room, not empty, but sacred. He encouraged the attendees to look at their own struggles not as endings, but as beginnings, to ask themselves, what can this teach me? Who can I help because of what I survived? How can I use my story to light someone else's path? Life, Ethan explained, wasn't about avoiding hardship. It was about discovering who you became because of it, and in that sense, every loss carried a hidden invitation to grow, to change, to begin again. People listened with a stillness that meant they understood. Some wiped tears from their eyes, others nodded solemnly. A few held hands. Ethan didn't ask anyone to be strong. He simply reminded them that strength often grows in silence, in tiny steps, in the moments when giving up feels easier than continuing. As the gathering ended, Ethan shared one last message, words he wished someone had told him on the cold nights he spent in his car. No matter what you've lost, no matter how dark it feels, it is never too late to find meaning. Sometimes the greatest purpose comes after the greatest pain. He smiled gently, a man who had lived every word he spoke. Your story isn't over. It's just taking a turn. Keep walking, keep breathing, keep trying. And one day you'll look back and realize that the part of your life you thought was the end was actually the beginning of everything. The room erupted into quiet applause, soft, emotional, sincere. People lingered afterward to thank him, to share their own stories, to say how his journey had helped them find strength in their own. As the last few attendees left and the lights dimmed, Ethan stood alone in the room, feeling a profound stillness settle in his chest. He had once lost everything, and in that emptiness he had found the one thing he never knew he was searching for, a purpose that touched lives far beyond his own. He stepped outside into the cool evening air. The world felt wide again, possible again, full of beginnings. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan walked forward with a heart that knew exactly where it was meant to be.